The sky over the Atlantic was a cold, endless gray, where the horizon seemed to dissolve into mist and water. The waves crashed like cannon fire against steel hulls, and beneath that restless ocean, death moved silently. It was May 22, 1943, a date few would remember, but one that would quietly shift the course of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. A single aircraft, a Grumman TBF Avenger, roared through the heavy clouds, slicing toward the waves below. Lieutenant Commander William Drain, commander of Composite Squadron 9, gripped the controls, his eyes fixed on the shadow beneath the surface. A German U-boat, U-569, diving fast to escape. He had only seconds to act. One wrong move and the hunter would vanish, leaving no trace but the churn of the sea. Before we go further, take a second. If you love these hidden war stories, the kind history books barely mention, make sure to subscribe right now. We're building a community that keeps these incredible untold moments alive. It takes one click, but it means you'll never miss the next forgotten chapter of history. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story travels today. Now back to the Atlantic. Drain's heart pounded as he dropped altitude. The Avenger dove from 600 feet to 300, the engines screaming. The submarine below was in chaos, its crew running to man the deck gun before disappearing beneath the waves. Drain's crew called out distance and speed. 90 seconds, maybe less. He had to be exact. Too early and he'd miss. Too late, and his aircraft could be caught in the blast. 2 depth charges fell from his bomb bay, splashing into the water just 15 feet behind the U-boat's conning tower. 4 seconds later, a double eruption shattered the ocean. Twin plumes of white water shot skyward, and the shock wave tore through the submarine's hull like lightning through glass. Inside, compartments ruptured. Oil spilled upward, spreading into a black stain across the waves. Circling overhead, Drain watched as sailors climbed out of the conning tower, their faces pale and wet with fear. Their steel beast was dying. The commander had no choice but to give the order, abandon ship. Moments later, 47 German sailors floated helplessly in their life vests, watching their submarine, their home, sink stern first into the deep. Dark Atlantic. Canadian destroyer HMCS St. Laurent arrived, rescuing 25 survivors. 21 never made it. To most, it was another small victory in a vast, brutal war. But history would prove it was something far greater. This was the moment when a strange, slow, useless little ship, the USS Bogue, changed everything. The Bogue wasn't a mighty fleet carrier or a sleek warship. She was small, clumsy, and converted from a merchant vessel. The Navy brass had called her impractical, a waste of steel. Yet she had just achieved what months of traditional warfare couldn't. She had destroyed a U-boat in the middle of the Atlantic. What no one realized then was that this single victory marked the beginning of a revolution in naval warfare, one that would flip the balance of the entire Atlantic conflict. In the months leading up to that day, the Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. The German U-boat threat had grown into a nightmare. In just the first 20 days of March 1943, Admiral Karl Donitz's submarines had sunk 82 Allied merchant ships, nearly 500,000 tons of cargo gone. Convoys HX-229 and SC-122 lost 22 ships in 4 days. Each explosion meant lives lost, supplies gone, and hope sinking fast. Britain's survival depended on the lifeline from North America, but the Atlantic was turning into a graveyard. In the middle of that ocean lay a vast region sailors called the Black Pit, 700 miles of open water beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. Here, German wolf packs hunted freely, surfacing at night to attack convoys with torpedoes that lit up the ocean like silent fireworks. U-boat captains called it their paradise. Allied sailors called it their hell. The United States Navy needed a miracle, something that could protect convoys where no plane could reach. But they had nothing that fit the job. Long-range bombers were too far inland, and fleet carriers were too big, too valuable, and too few to risk in convoy duty. That's when an idea began to take shape. Small, cheap, and expendable ships with flight decks, capable of carrying a few planes each. Not elegant, not powerful, but everywhere. The problem? The Navy hated it. In 1940, when the concept was first proposed, top admirals laughed it off. These small carriers will be floating coffins, they said. Too slow to escape, too weak to defend themselves. Secretary Frank Knox declared that converting merchant ships into carriers was obsolete before it even began. The Navy wanted speed, armor and massive air wings, not sluggish cargo, ships with wooden decks. But then came President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt saw what his admirals couldn't. He understood that the war in the Atlantic wasn't a battle between fleets. It was a battle between submarines and supply ships. What mattered most wasn't striking power. It was presence. Convoys needed constant air cover, not just occasional patrols. A small carrier could stay with them for weeks. On December 21, 1940, Roosevelt overruled his own Navy and ordered the conversion of merchant ships into escort carriers. They may be slow, he said, but they can be everywhere. The first was the USS Long Island, commissioned on June 2, 1941. Built from a cargo hull, she carried 21 planes and could barely make 16 knots. Her wooden deck and lack of armor made her look like a ship built for disaster. Sailors nicknamed her the Flattop Mule. But Roosevelt's gamble wasn't about beauty. It was about numbers. One fleet carrier could take 2 years to build. 10 escort carriers could be built in that same time. By 1942, more followed, ugly, awkward, and invaluable. Then came USS Bogue, commissioned on September 26, 1942. She displaced 390 tons, had a flight deck of 442 feet, and could carry barely 24 aircraft. The Navy's pilots joked that CVE stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. Her top speed was 18 knots, slower than some of the ships she escorted. Yet for all her flaws, she carried something more important than speed or armor. She carried airplanes into the one place none could go, the heart of the Atlantic. Her crew didn't know it yet, but they were about to change naval history forever. At first, though, the skeptics seemed right. The Bogue's early missions were a mess. Mechanical failures plagued her, and on her first 3 convoy crossings, not a single U-boat was sunk. Her aircraft could force submarines to dive, but they couldn't kill them. Critics used it as proof these ships were useless. Reports circulated recommending the end of the escort carrier program. Then came Admiral Ernest King, a man as stubborn as the ocean itself. King had watched the British experiment with something radical: hunter-killer groups, escort carriers that didn't just guard convoys, but actively hunted submarines. It was risky, but King knew it was the only way forward. In April 1943, he gave the order. The USS Bogue and her destroyer escorts would no longer defend convoys. They would hunt. That decision changed everything. What happened next would not only break the back of the U-boat fleet, it would redefine modern naval warfare. When the USS Bogue left Norfolk on April 22, 1943, her crew had no idea they were sailing into history. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, cold, gray, and merciless. The men aboard knew one thing: the Atlantic was a graveyard, and they were sailing straight into it. For months, German U-boats had dominated these waters, slipping through the waves like steel sharks, cutting lifelines between North America and Britain. But this time, things would be different. The Bogue wasn't on a defensive mission. She was on the hunt. Accompanied by 4 destroyers, Bogue formed the U.S. Navy's first hunter-killer group, a bold experiment that would soon change the rhythm of the war. Instead of escorting convoys, she roamed the ocean, guided by whispers, coded radio transmissions, mysterious bearings, and faint signals detected by HFDF, high-frequency direction finding. Somewhere out there beneath the waves, Germany's Wolfpacks prowled. The first contact came on May 21, 1943. The crew of Bogue intercepted frantic U-boat transmissions, messages from Wolfpack Mosel, a formation of 21 submarines preparing to strike a convoy. Lieutenant Commander William Drain and his squadron launched 5 Avengers into the stormy sky, engines howling as they raced toward the coordinates. Minutes later, they spotted their first target, U-231, caught on the surface while recharging its batteries. The submarine's crew scrambled in panic as Drain's depth charges dropped like judgment. The explosions ripped across the ocean, and though U-231 wasn't sunk, her communications were destroyed, forcing her to limp home to France. That was the first blow, small but symbolic. The hunter-killer group had drawn blood. The next day brought the moment that would silence every critic in the U.S. Navy. Multiple Bogue aircraft hunted 5 separate submarines throughout the day. One of them, U-569, never surfaced again. Drain's attack had not only avenged hundreds of lost Allied ships, It had proven that the escort carrier idea worked. A ship once dismissed as too slow to matter had just sunk a German U-boat in the deadliest stretch of the Atlantic. The effect was electric. The Bogue's crew erupted in celebration, but the real victory was strategic. For the first time, the U.S. Navy could fight the U-boats on its own terms. They weren't waiting for convoys to be attacked anymore. They were striking first. By June, the Bogue had become a ghost story among German submariners. Her aircraft patrolled endlessly, hunting day and night. On June 5th, Avengers spotted 2 submarines, U-217 and a refueling tanker, in mid-Atlantic. Both were caught on the surface mid-operation, their crews unaware that death was coming from above. The Avengers' depth charges tore through the ocean, sending both subs to the bottom. There were no survivors. A week later, the sea claimed another. On June 12th, Bogue's aircraft found U-118 attempting to recharge its batteries. The submarine crash-dived, but too late. Depth charges detonated beneath her hull, rupturing her pressure compartments. She went down with all 49 hands. In the following months, Bogue's legend grew. Her 8th patrol, from November to December 1943, would become one of the most successful anti-submarine operations in naval history. Her aircraft and destroyers worked in perfect rhythm, each movement rehearsed through experience and instinct. On December 13th, U-172 was located through radio intercepts. For 27 relentless hours, Bogue's planes and destroyers hunted her down. The ocean boiled with depth charges. The submarine twisted, dove surfaced, dove again, until finally she broke apart. 46 Germans were rescued, 13 killed. A week later, on December 20th, another submarine, U-850, was destroyed. In 6 weeks, Bogue's group had sunk 3 submarines. By year's end, she and her escorts had destroyed 11 German U-boats and 2 Japanese submarines. Not a single convoy was lost under her watch. Not one of her aircraft was shot down by enemy fire. The result stunned even the skeptics. The escort carrier program, once ridiculed, was now rewriting naval warfare. The baby Flattops were killing giants, but Bogue was only the beginning. Her sister ships, USS Card, USS Core, and USS Block Island, joined the hunt. Card alone accounted for 11 kills, Core added 7. Block Island matched 7 more before she was finally torpedoed by U-549 on May 29, 1944. The only American escort carrier ever lost to a submarine in the Atlantic, the tide had turned. Just 2 months earlier, in March 1943, Admiral Donitz's U-boats had been unstoppable, sinking 82 ships totaling nearly 500,000 tons. But by May, everything changed. That month would be remembered forever by the German Navy as Black May. In those 31 days, 41 U-boats were destroyed. 18 went down in convoy battles, overwhelmed by new tactics and better weapons. 14 were destroyed by air patrols equipped with new radar that could detect them even in darkness and fog. The rest, the unlucky few, were sunk by hunter-killer groups like Bogue's. Among them were 5 vital milk cows, submarine tankers that refueled other U-boats far from home. Without them, Germany's underwater fleet began to starve. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. Admiral Donitz, commander of the U-boat arm, could hardly believe what was happening. On May 24, 1943, he sent an encrypted message to all submarines. Losses are too heavy. All boats are to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. Return to base. It was a coded admission of defeat. In just 3 weeks, a war that had raged beneath the waves for nearly 4 years was turned upside down. The Battle of the Atlantic had entered a new phase, one dominated by small, slow ships that had once been laughed at by every admiral in the Navy. But behind that success was something even greater, the power of American industry. While Bogue hunted in the Atlantic, shipyards back home were building her sisters faster than anyone thought possible. Henry Kaiser's shipyards, famous for producing Liberty ships at record speeds, now began constructing the Casablanca-class escort carriers, purpose-built from the keel up, rather than converted merchant hulls. Kaiser wasn't a traditional shipbuilder. He was an engineer, a visionary who applied mass production techniques to ship construction. His yards didn't build ships one by one. They built them like machines. Prefabricated sections were assembled inland, welded together, and then shipped to the docks. Modular construction allowed teams to work on multiple parts of different ships simultaneously, As a result, build times collapsed from 8 months to just 3.5. At the peak of production, Kaiser's yards were launching one escort carrier every 7.3 days, faster than some shipyards could build destroyers. Each Casablanca-class carrier was a refinement of the earlier designs, more stable, better equipped, slightly faster. They displaced 7,800 tons, made 19 knots, and carried 28 aircraft. They were still small, still lightly armed, but perfectly suited for the relentless, grinding war against the U-boats. As production boomed, hunter-killer groups multiplied. Escort carriers now roamed the Atlantic in packs like wolves hunting the wolves. New weapons joined the fight. Radar that could pierce the fog, acoustic torpedoes that could home in on the sound of a submarine's propellers. The ocean, once Germany's deadliest weapon, was becoming its prison. By late 1944, the escort carriers weren't just tools of survival. They were symbols of dominance. The war that had once belonged to the silent killers now belonged to the sky. By 1944, the Atlantic no longer belonged to the hunters. It belonged to the hunted. The ocean that had once echoed with the silent menace of U-boats was now ruled by the low rumble of American engines, by the steady beat of aircraft launching from wooden decks on steel ships that the world had once laughed at. The escort carriers were no longer experiments. They were the heart of the Atlantic war machine. Their tactics had evolved into a deadly art form. Each hunter-killer group moved with precision, aircraft searching in expanding circles, destroyers cutting through the waves below, sonar teams listening for the faint hum of propellers deep in the abyss. When radar screens flashed with contact, a flurry of motion followed. Pilots sprinted to their Avengers, deck crews armed depth charges, and within minutes, the tiny ships unleashed death from the sky. The Grumman TBF Avenger had become the symbol of this new kind of warfare. Slow, heavy, but unstoppable. It carried depth charges, acoustic torpedoes, or rockets depending on the target. It could fly for hours, patrol hundreds of miles, and attack in almost any weather. Inside the cramped cockpit, a pilot, radioman, and gunner worked as one, each knowing that one mistake could send them crashing into the unforgiving Atlantic. At first, the main weapon remained depth charges. Pilots would drop them in tight patterns, their explosions creating deadly underwater shockwaves. But by 1944, something new entered the fight, the Mark 24 Fido acoustic torpedo. It didn't rely on luck or perfect aim. Once dropped, it homed in on the sound of a submarine's propellers, weaving through the depths like a predator that never missed. U-boat captains learned quickly. Diving deep no longer guaranteed safety. The more they tried to flee, the louder their engines screamed and the faster the torpedoes found them. This technology changed everything. What had once been a chess match between hunter and hunted had turned into a massacre. U-boat commanders began to fear the sound of aircraft engines more than any convoy escort. Many described the same nightmare, surfacing at night to recharge batteries, then suddenly being illuminated by the cold light of radar-equipped planes. Within minutes, the ocean erupted around them. Bombs, rockets, torpedoes, and all falling from the darkness. What was once the safest time to surface had become a death sentence. The hunter-killer groups perfected their methods. Each patrol covered hundreds of miles. Every sighting triggered a coordinated assault. A single sonar ping could launch an entire storm of aircraft and destroyers. If a U-boat dove, surface ships boxed it in, forcing it to stay submerged until its batteries died. The Germans called these endless, suffocating hunts Todeskäfige, death cages. And still, the carriers came, more every month, flooding the Atlantic like an industrial tide. In one secret memo from Admiral Francis Lowe, Chief of Staff of the U.S. 10th Fleet, he admitted something that only a year earlier would have sounded like madness. Between April and September 1944, escort carrier groups accounted for approximately 60% of all enemy submarines destroyed in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. 6 out of every 10 U-boats sunk, gone because of ships that the Navy had once refused to build, but their success didn't stop there. Escort carriers were doing far more than just hunting submarines. They had become floating lifelines, multi-tools of war. When the Allies launched Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, escort carriers provided air cover for landing forces. When American and British troops stormed the beaches of southern France during Operation Dragoon, escort carriers loitered offshore for days, their small squadrons striking targets, guiding artillery and scouting enemy movements. They were slow, yes, but they could stay. That was their secret weapon: endurance. A fleet carrier might strike and vanish, but an escort carrier could linger over a battlefield for days, its pilots sleeping in cramped bunks between sorties. These jeep carriers were everywhere, in every convoy on every coast, always watching. Meanwhile, back home, shipyards like Henry Kaiser's continued to churn them out in numbers that defied comprehension. The Casablanca-class carriers, 50 of them built in a single year, represented the very peak of wartime production. At one point, Kaiser's yards were launching a completed escort carrier every week. Each ship was identical, modular, and efficient. They could be repaired, refitted, or replaced faster than the enemy could sink them. By 1944, the United States had built 151 aircraft carriers in total. 122 of them were escort carriers. That's 80%. The ocean was no longer vast enough to hide the U-boats. Everywhere they went, small flight decks followed them, carrying eyes that never slept. The transformation was complete. But war is never static. The U-boats adapted too. Admiral Donitz refused to give up. He ordered his engineers to build a new generation of submarines, the type Anti-Submarine. Sleek, fast, and deadly, these electro-boats could travel faster underwater than most ships could on the surface. They could dive deeper, stay submerged longer, and strike without warning. Had they arrived earlier, the Atlantic might have burned again. But it was too late. Allied bombers had crippled German shipyards. Only 118 Type Anti-Submarine boats were completed, and most never saw combat. By the time the first ones set sail, the war was nearly over. In the meantime, escort carriers kept hunting. Their crews were exhausted, half-frozen, often seasick beyond measure. The ships rolled violently in heavy seas. The flat-bottom hulls slammed against the waves so hard that sailors joked, these ships would roll on wet grass. Sleep was rare. Food was cold. Space was tighter than a coffin. But no one complained. They had a mission, and they were winning. Still, the war demanded more than endurance. It demanded courage. The capture of U-505 in June 1944 became one of the most daring naval operations of the entire war. It was a moment when the hunters risked everything, not just to destroy, but to seize. It began when the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, commanded by Captain Daniel Gallery, was patrolling near the coast of West Africa. Gallery was bold. Some said reckless. But he had a plan that bordered on insane: capture a German submarine intact. He drilled his crews relentlessly, practicing how to board a submarine, disable explosives, and secure secret documents. No one had ever done it before. On June 4th, destroyers accompanying Guadalcanal detected sonar contact, a submarine. Depth charges thundered through the water. Hours later, the gray shape of U-505 burst through the surface, trailing oil, her crew spilling out in panic. They abandoned ship, convinced the Americans would finish them off. But Gallery had different orders. "Do not sink her," he shouted. "Take her." Lieutenant Albert David led the boarding party. He and 8 men climbed into a small boat, bouncing across the waves toward the enemy vessel. They expected an explosion at any second. Scuttling charges were set to detonate. But luck or fate was with them. The charges failed. The Americans climbed aboard, weapons ready, the submarine filling with water. Inside, they found chaos. Alarms blaring, wires sparking, diesel fumes thick in the air. They raced through, the compartments shutting valves, disarming explosives, and stopping the flooding. Against all odds, they saved the submarine. For the first time since 1812, the U.S. Navy had captured an enemy warship at sea. What they found inside was priceless: an intact Enigma machine, code books, maps, and torpedoes. A treasure trove of intelligence. The capture of U-505 gave Allied cryptographers insight into German operations that would remain secret for years. The entire event was classified until after the war. To prevent the Germans from realizing their codes were compromised, U-505 became a symbol of what the escort carriers had achieved: not just domination, but mastery. The very enemy that once ruled the Atlantic now floated in an American harbor as a war prize. Today, U-505 still rests in Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry, a silent reminder of that moment when ingenuity defeated arrogance. As 1944 turned to 1945, the numbers told the story. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Atlantic, once Germany's deadliest weapon, had become its grave. Out of 785 U-boats deployed during the war, 630 were destroyed. 53 of those kills came from the escort carrier groups alone. The cost was real. 6 escort carriers lost to enemy action, but the trade was devastatingly one-sided. They had saved thousands of lives, countless convoys, and possibly the war itself. By late 1944, the war had changed forever. The Atlantic was no longer a battleground, it was a victory monument. Escort carriers had done what no one thought possible. They had silenced the wolf packs, protected the convoys, and turned the tides of a war fought across millions of miles of ocean. But as the thunder of battle faded in the west, a new storm rose in the Pacific. The small, scrappy carriers that had once hunted submarines were about to face something far worse: the full power of the Japanese Imperial Navy. October 25, 1944. The dawn was blood-red over the Philippines. In the distance, 6 escort carriers, part of Task Unit 77. 4.3, known as Taffy 3, cut through the calm waters of Leyte Gulf. Their mission was simple: support the American landings by providing air cover and close support for ground troops. They were not supposed to fight major enemy fleets. Their planes carried depth charges and small bombs meant for submarines, not armor-piercing weapons. Their decks were tiny, their armor thin, and their escort ships, a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, looked pitiful next to the steel monsters lurking beyond the horizon. Then, without warning, the calm shattered. Lookouts aboard the carrier USS Fanshawe Bay saw what no one thought possible: battleship masts rising on the horizon, shimmering in the tropical haze. Within minutes, Japanese shells began falling around them, sending plumes of water hundreds of feet into the air. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, small, slow, and lightly armed, had stumbled directly into the path of Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force: 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, including the terrifying Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. For the sailors aboard Taffy 3, there was no time to think, only to act. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, the commander, ordered every aircraft launched, no matter what weapons they carried. Pilots sprinted to their planes, some carrying depth charges instead of torpedoes, others with only machine gun ammo. One pilot later recalled, "We didn't have time to arm properly. I just took off and hoped I'd find something to shoot at." The escort carriers turned east, their engines straining at maximum speed, a pitiful 17 knots, while massive 18-inch shells from Yamato screamed overhead. The sky was chaos. Japanese shells thundered into the water, geysers towering around the small ships. Fragments rained across the decks. The air filled with smoke, tracer fire, and the deafening roar of aircraft engines. The destroyers guarding Taffy 3 didn't hesitate. They turned straight toward the enemy. USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, charged headlong at the Japanese fleet. "All ahead flank," he shouted. "Let's get in close and do what damage we can." Johnston's 5-inch guns opened fire, hammering a Japanese cruiser until it was engulfed in flames. Then, through a wall of shell fire, she launched torpedoes that struck a Japanese battleship squarely in the hull. The retaliation was immediate. A storm of shells tore into the tiny destroyer, shredding her decks, killing crewmen, destroying her engines. But Evans refused to stop. He limped the Johnston closer, firing until his last gun fell silent. When his ship finally sank, sailors in the water watched him stand on the bridge, still giving orders. He went down with his ship. His sacrifice gave the escort carriers precious minutes, time enough for their planes to strike. The sky filled with American aircraft diving through anti-aircraft fire, attacking with everything they had: rockets, depth charges, even machine gun bursts. Pilots made repeated passes with empty weapons just to distract Japanese gunners. Some deliberately flew low to draw fire away from their ships. On the carrier USS Gambier Bay, shells began tearing through the unarmored hull. Fires erupted across the deck. She listed to port, engines dead. Her crew fought to keep her afloat, but she was doomed. Minutes later, she rolled over and sank. 147 men lost. The survivors watched in disbelief as another carrier, USS St. Lo, fought off waves of attacks, only to be struck by the first organized kamikaze assault of the war. A Japanese Zero crashed into her flight deck, igniting a chain reaction. Explosions ripped through the ship, and within half an hour she was gone. The sea burned with oil and debris. Yet somehow, through all the chaos, 4 escort carriers escaped. And incredibly, miraculously, the Japanese fleet turned away. Admiral Kurita, convinced he had stumbled into the main American carrier force, ordered his ships to retreat. He had faced phantom giants and fled from them. The tiny ships of Taffy III had bluffed the most powerful fleet in the Pacific. The battle off Samar would later be called the most gallant action in the history of the U.S. Navy. Those 6 carriers, built to hunt submarines, had stood toe-to-toe with battleships and survived. When word of the battle reached the United States, it became a legend overnight. It was proof that courage, ingenuity, and stubbornness could overcome even the most impossible odds. The escort carriers had done the unthinkable. They had fought battleships with wooden decks and tin hulls and won. After that day, there was no doubt left about the value of these ships. The admirals who had once mocked them as death traps now spoke their names with reverence. The same Navy that had resisted their creation began designing new classes of purpose-built escort carriers, stronger, faster, more advanced. But by the time they rolled off the production lines, the war was nearly over. The U-boat threat had been crushed. The Atlantic was safe. The Pacific was on the brink of victory. The escort carriers had done their job so completely that they had made themselves obsolete. Still, their impact couldn't be erased. The lessons they taught about adaptability, persistence, and sheer willpower reshaped naval strategy forever. The idea that small, inexpensive ships could achieve big victories became a cornerstone of modern warfare. In many ways, the escort carriers were the prototype for the future, flexible, efficient, and everywhere. After the war, most of them were decommissioned or scrapped. A few were turned into training vessels. By 1960, not one remained in active service. None were preserved as museums, but their legacy lived on in every carrier that came after. Every modern aircraft carrier, from nuclear-powered giants to helicopter assault ships, carries the DNA of those little escort carriers that braved the Atlantic. They proved something that goes beyond war itself, that greatness isn't about size or wealth or perfection. It's about showing up, refusing to quit, and doing the impossible when everyone else says it can't be done. Think about it. These were ships built from merchant hulls manned by ordinary sailors and pilots, commanded by officers who were told their mission was hopeless. And yet they didn't just fight. They changed history. By the end of World War II, those floating jokes had sunk more than 80 enemy submarines, shot down hundreds of aircraft, and protected millions of tons of supplies that kept the Allies alive. They closed the mid-Atlantic gap. They won the Battle of the Atlantic. They turned the tide of war. One pilot from Composite Squadron 9, the same group that flew from USS Bogue, was interviewed years later. When asked what it was like to fly from those tiny decks in the middle of the stormy Atlantic, he smiled and said, "We flew from a merchant ship with a flight deck nailed on top. We sank submarines that were supposed to be sinking us. The brass said we couldn't do it, but we did it anyway." That sentence says it all. These men didn't have the biggest ships, the fastest planes, or the strongest weapons. What they had was belief. Belief in their mission, belief in their brothers beside them, belief that they could make a difference even when the odds were impossible. And in the end, they were right. So the next time someone tells you that you're too small, too inexperienced, or too late to make a difference, remember the escort carriers. Remember the Bogue, the Card, the Core, the Block Island, the Gambier Bay, and all the others that faced the impossible and refuse to back down. They prove that sometimes the smallest ships make the biggest waves. If you've stayed with this story until now, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. These stories deserve to be remembered, not buried under textbooks. So before you go, hit that subscribe button, not just for more incredible war stories, but to keep the spirit of courage, innovation, and sacrifice alive for the next generation. Tell us in the comments, from where in the world are you watching? Let's see how far the story of these tiny giants can travel. And remember, history doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who refuse to be forgotten.